When London's great river froze solid in the bitter winter of 1434, merchants rejoiced at the novelty, while the poor prayed simply to survive until spring. Good evening, dear friend. As you settle beneath your warm covers tonight, let me take you back nearly 600 years to a London you would scarcely recognize. A city of timber and thatch, of narrow winding lanes thick with mud and waste, where the mighty River Thames was not merely the city's lifeblood but its very heartbeat, its highway and marketplace, its source of water and fish and commerce. Tonight, I want to tell you about what happened when that heartbeat stopped, when the river itself became an enemy, and about one young woman who lived through those frozen months with a courage she never knew she possessed. Her name was Agnes Carpenter, and she was 19 years old in that terrible winter, though if you had seen her bent over her washing in the icy water of the public conduit near Cheapside, you might have guessed her to be 30 or more. Her hands were red and raw, split at the knuckles from the cold, and the harsh lye soap she made from wood ash and animal fat. Her face was thin, with high cheekbones that pressed against pale skin, and her eyes, a curious shade between gray and green, like the Thames itself on a cloudy morning, held both a wariness and a fierce determination that had kept her alive through 18 London winters before this one. Agnes had been born in the spring of 1415, just days after King Henry V had sailed for France on the campaign that would lead to his great victory at Agincourt. Her mother, Joan, had been a laundress who took in washing from the households of merchants and minor gentry in the wards around St. Paul's Cathedral. Her father she had never known. Joan would only say he had been a carpenter from Southwark who had promised to marry her, and then disappeared when he learned a child was coming. It was from this phantom father that Agnes had taken her surname, though she had never held a carpenter's tool in her life. Joan had taught her daughter the laundress's trade from the time Agnes could walk, and by the age of 7, the girl was already carrying bundles of soiled linens nearly as large as herself through the crowded streets. She learned to recognize the fine wool of a merchant's tunic, to know the difference between the sturdy canvas of a sailor's clothes and the delicate linen of a lady's chemise. She learned which stains would yield to cold water, and which required the hottest her reddened hands could bear. She learned to wring and beat and scrub until her shoulders ached and her back felt as though it might break. And she learned that in London, in England, in all of Christendom, a woman alone with no father, no husband, no son to protect her, was as vulnerable as a sparrow in a storm. When Agnes was 12, her mother had taken a fever after falling through thin ice while rinsing sheets in the Fleet River. Joan had lived 3 days, burning hot to the touch, calling out for the carpenter who had left her, before she died on a straw mattress in the single room they rented above a tallow chandler's shop in Bread Street ward. Agnes had sold her mother's few possessions, a wooden bowl, a bone comb, a kirtle that was only slightly less patched than the one Joan died in, to pay for a burial in the churchyard of St. Mildred's. She could not afford a stone or even a wooden marker, but the priest had been kind enough to note Joan Carpenter in the parish register, and Agnes thought that was a kind of immortality, to have one's name written down where it might last beyond memory, For 7 years after her mother's death, Agnes had continued the laundress's trade alone. She was known among the housewives and servants of Cheapside and Cordwainer Street as reliable, if quiet, a girl who asked few questions and kept her eyes down, who never stole so much as a brass button from the garments entrusted to her care. She had inherited her mother's clients, though some of the wives had looked at the young girl with suspicion, wondering if she might catch the eye of a husband or son. But Agnes had learned early to make herself as inconspicuous as possible, to fade into the background like the steam rising from a washing pot. She lived frugally, spending her few pennies on the cheapest bread and the vegetables that were beginning to rot at the market stalls, supplementing her diet with the fish heads and scraps the fishmongers at Billingsgate would sometimes sell for nearly nothing at the end of the day. She continued to rent the room above the chandler's shop, though the chandler himself, a widower named Thomas Godwin, had died 2 years after her mother, and his son now ran the business with considerably less kindness than his father had shown. Young Robert Godwin had raised her rent twice in as many years, and Agnes suspected he was trying to force her out so he might rent the room to someone who could pay more. In the autumn of 1434, as the leaves turned gold and russet in the gardens of the great houses, and the air took on the sharp edge of the coming winter, Agnes had felt the first stirrings of real fear. The previous winter had been hard enough, with food prices rising and the Thames freezing at the edges for weeks at a time. But this year, even before the first frost, there was something different in the air, a tension, a sense of impending crisis that seemed to press down on the city like a heavy hand. The harvest had been poor, with weeks of rain in August spoiling much of the grain. Prices for wheat and barley had climbed steadily throughout September and October. The master bakers were grumbling about the cost of flour, and that meant their customers would soon be grumbling about the cost of bread. And then, in late November, the cold came. It had not arrived gradually, as it usually did, with increasingly chilly mornings giving way to the occasional frost. Instead, it had descended on London like a great beast settling over its prey, swift and complete and merciless. On the 23rd of November, a Wednesday, Agnes remembered, the sky had been gray but relatively mild, with a dampness in the air that spoke of rain. She had taken a bundle of sheets from Marjorie Ashfield, the wife of a prosperous fishmonger, and had spent the afternoon scrubbing them at the public conduit, her hands numb in the cold water but not unbearably so. She had wrung them out and carried them back to her room, draping them over a rope she had strung from one wall to another, hoping they would be dry enough by morning to take to the parish church of St. Mary-le-Bow, where the priest allowed her to use the churchyard for bleaching when the weather was fair. But by nightfall, the temperature had plummeted. Agnes, huddled under her threadbare blanket and the spare kirtle that served as her only other covering, had felt the cold seeping through the walls like water through a sieve. She could hear the wind howling through the narrow streets, rattling shutters and whipping through the thatched roofs. And in the morning, when pale gray light finally filtered through the gaps in her shutters, she had opened them to find the world transformed. Snow lay thick on every surface, deeper than she had ever seen it in November. The streets below were invisible beneath a blanket of white, and icicles hung from every eave and gutter like the teeth of some monstrous creature. The Thames, visible in glimpses between the buildings, was no longer its usual murky brown but a dark gray, sluggish and thick with ice at its edges. The few people who ventured out moved quickly, hunched against the cold, their breath forming clouds before their faces. And the temperature was like nothing Agnes had experienced, a cold that seemed to pierce straight through wool and linen and flesh to settle in the bones themselves. The sheets she had washed the day before were frozen solid, hanging from her rope like stiff white boards. She had tried to fold them and found it impossible. They would have snapped like kindling. She left them hanging and wrapped herself in her cloak, thin brown wool, patched at the elbows, and ventured out into the transformed city. The cold hit her like a physical blow. It stole her breath, made her eyes water, sent needles of pain through her ears and fingers despite the cloth she wrapped around her hands. The snow crunched under her feet, already packed hard by the few people who had passed before her. Every breath burned in her throat and lungs. She pulled her cloak tighter and made her way toward Cheapside, toward the bakeries and cookshops where she might find work, toward the market where she might learn what this sudden winter would mean for people like her. What she found was a city in shock. The market stalls were only half set, with fewer vendors than usual and even fewer customers. Those merchants who had braved the cold were demanding prices that made Agnes's heart sink. A loaf of bread that would have cost a farthing 2 weeks ago now cost twice that. Salt fish, dried peas, even turnips and onions, everything had become suddenly, impossibly expensive. She heard men arguing with vendors, their voices sharp with anger and fear. She saw women walking away from stalls with empty baskets and tight faces. And everywhere, people spoke of the Thames. Frozen at London Bridge, an old man was saying to a cluster of listeners near the Alener Cross, "Solid enough you could walk across, if you were mad enough to try." "The wherries can't move," a woman added, her voice anxious. "How will the coal get upriver? How will the grain come in from the country?" Agnes had stood listening, feeling the fear that had been stirring in her belly since autumn, now blooming into something closer to panic. The Thames was London's lifeline. Everything came by river, coal from Newcastle, grain from Kent and Essex, timber from the forest upriver, salt fish from the North Sea. The city's 40,000 souls depended on that constant flow of goods up and down the river. If the ice stopped the boats, if the cold lasted not for days but for weeks, she had returned to her room with no work and no food, having spent one of her precious farthings on a small loaf that would have to last her 2 days. The sheets were still frozen. The cold in her room was scarcely less than the cold outside. She had sat on her mattress, a sack stuffed with straw that was now 3 years old and compressed to almost nothing, and tried to think. She had perhaps 8 pennies to her name. If bread prices stayed as they were, that would buy her food for 2 weeks, maybe 3 if she was very careful. She had a small store of dried peas and a precious half-wheel of hard cheese she had been saving for Christmas. The rent on her room was due in 3 weeks, and Robert Godwin would not wait for his money, of that she was certain. Her firewood was nearly gone, and coal was now so expensive that she couldn't even consider buying it. Her shoes were worn through at the sole, and the cold was already making her feet ache even through the rags she stuffed in them for insulation. But worse than all of this was the simple, unavoidable fact that her livelihood had vanished overnight. No one would hire a laundress in this weather, who would want their clothes washed in water that would freeze on the line, who would pay to have garments soaked and scrubbed when keeping them dry seemed victory enough. There would be no work for her until the thaw came, and looking at the iron-gray sky through her window, feeling the cold that seemed to intensify with each passing hour, Agnes could not imagine when that might be. She was not alone in her fear. All across London, the poor and the laboring people were realizing what this sudden, savage winter would mean. The city had no system for relief, no public stores of grain or coal to distribute in times of hardship. The church provided some charity, soup kitchens at the monasteries, distributions of bread at parish churches, but there were thousands in need and never enough to go around. Those who had no savings, no family to turn to, no master to provide for them, were left to fend for themselves. And fending for oneself in a London winter, when the river had frozen and the normal rhythms of commerce had ground to a halt, was a desperate business indeed. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of cold and hunger. The snow kept falling, day after day, until the streets were canyons carved through drifts that reached to Agnes's waist in places. The Thames froze solid from bank to bank, the ice growing thicker by the day until it was said to be a foot deep in places. Agnes ventured out each morning to see if any work might be found, wrapping her feet in rags, her hands in strips torn from her spare kirtle, her face in the corner of her cloak. She asked at cookshops and bakeries, at the great houses of merchants, even at the taverns and alehouses. Though she knew her chances there were slim. Respectable women did not work in such places, and Agnes, for all her poverty, clung to the respectability her mother had taught her was a woman's only real protection. But there was no work. The cold had brought the city almost to a standstill. Those who could afford to stayed indoors, burning whatever fuel they could obtain, eating from stores laid up before the freeze. The markets were thin and expensive. The bakers were running short of flour as the grain supplies, which normally came by river, failed to arrive. The few carts that made it into the city on the frozen roads demanded exorbitant prices for their goods, knowing the Londoners had no choice but to pay. Agnes watched her store of pennies dwindle with a sick feeling in her stomach. 2 pennies for a loaf of bread. A penny for a handful of dried peas. Another penny for a precious bundle of kindling from a boy selling scraps he had scavenged from demolished buildings. She rationed her food carefully, eating once a day, sometimes less. The hunger was a constant gnawing ache, but she had known hunger before. It was an old, familiar companion. The cold was worse. The cold was relentless and inescapable, an enemy that never slept, never retreated, never showed mercy. At night, she would lie under her blanket and her spare kirtle, wearing every stitch of clothing she owned, and still she would shiver so hard her teeth chattered. Her room faced north and caught no sun even at midday. Frost formed on the inside of the walls, and her breath hung in clouds before her face. She could hear the mice that lived in the walls moving sluggishly, driven indoors by the cold like all of God's creatures. Sometimes she would hear people passing in the street below, their voices tight with cold and fear. Once she heard a child crying and a woman's voice, sharp with exhaustion, telling the child there was no more bread. They would have to wait until morning. It was on the 12th day of the Great Freeze. Agnes had been marking them off on a stick, cutting a notch for each day, that she met Edmund. She had gone to the river that morning, drawn by a curiosity she could not quite name. She had heard people saying that the ice was so thick you could walk on it, that people were crossing from one bank to the other, that enterprising vendors were even setting up stalls on the frozen surface. It seemed impossible, unnatural. The Thames was a powerful river, wide and deep and strong, and the idea that it could be tamed by the cold, that people could walk on it as easily as they walked on Cheapside, was something she needed to see with her own eyes. She made her way through the narrow streets of Bread Street Ward, past St. Mildred's where her mother was buried, past the silent workshops of cordwainers and glovers, down toward the river. The wind coming off the water was like a knife, cutting through her cloak as though it were made of cobwebs. Her eyes watered and her face felt numb, but still she pressed on, drawn by that strange compulsion to witness this impossible thing. And then she saw it and stopped and stared. The Thames was gone. In its place was a vast white plain, smooth and solid, stretching from bank to bank. Where there should have been water, dark and flowing and full of boats and barges and wherries, there was only ice, thick white ice, dimpled and ridged in places, smooth as glass in others. A few boats were caught in it, their hulls tilted at odd angles, frozen in place like flies in amber. And on the ice itself, impossibly, unbelievably, there were people. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, scattered across the frozen river. Some were walking cautiously, testing the ice with staff or poles. Others were more confident, striding across as though it were solid ground. Agnes could see vendors with their hand carts, selling hot pies and mulled ale to the curious crowds. Children were sliding on the ice, their laughter carrying across the frozen expanse. A group of young men were playing football, kicking a pig's bladder back and forth. It was like a fair, like a festival, like nothing Agnes had ever seen. She stood at the top of the stone steps that led down to the water's edge, now the ice's edge, and watched. Part of her wanted to turn away, to return to her cold room and her dwindling supplies, and wait for this nightmare to end. But another part, a part she hadn't known existed, wanted to step onto that ice, to walk on the river as though she were walking on a street, to be part of this strange and terrible marvel. Remarkable, isn't it? The voice made her jump. She turned to find a man standing beside her, not old, perhaps 30 or so, with a thin face partially hidden by a hood lined with what looked like rabbit fur. His cloak was thick wool, good quality, and his boots looked sturdy and well-made. A merchant, she thought, or perhaps a clerk to one of the great trading companies. Not a nobleman, but not someone who had to worry about his next meal either. "I've never seen anything like it," Agnes said, her voice rough from disuse. She had spoken to almost no one in days. "Nor has anyone else living," the man said. "My grandfather used to tell stories about the Great Freeze when he was a boy. That would have been back in King Richard's time, before the old king was deposed. He said the Thames froze then, but not like this. Never like this." He gestured at the ice with one gloved hand. "They're saying it's God's judgment. A sign of the end times." Agnes said nothing. People always said such things when disaster struck: plague, famine, earthquake, flood. It was God's judgment, God's wrath, God's punishment for sin. But the cold seemed to fall on the righteous and the wicked alike, and Agnes had long since stopped trying to understand why God allowed suffering. Her mother, who had been as kind and pious a woman as ever lived, had died in poverty and pain, while the landlord who had cheated them out of 3 months' rent lived in comfort still. If there was justice in it, it was beyond her comprehension. "Are you thinking of going onto the ice?" the man asked. There was something in his voice, not quite concern, but a kind of curiosity, an interest that made Agnes suddenly aware of how she must look. Her cloak was patched and thin. Her face was pinched with cold and hunger. Her hands, wrapped in their rags, were the hands of someone who worked with them for a living. She was not the sort of person a prosperous merchant would usually notice, let alone speak to. "I don't know," she said honestly. "It seems dangerous." "It is dangerous," the man agreed. "The ice may be thick, but the river still flows beneath it. There are weak spots, places where the current runs faster and keeps the ice thin. 3 people have drowned already, broken through into the water and been swept under the ice before anyone could pull them out." He paused, looking at her more closely. "But you're not here for the sport of it, are you? You're here because you're wondering if there's money to be made." Agnes felt her face flush despite the cold. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." The man's voice was not unkind. "I've seen you before, I think in Cheapside, carrying bundles of washing. You're a laundress." "I was," Agnes said. "There's no call for laundresses now." "No," the man agreed. "There wouldn't be." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the ice. "My name is Edmund Barlow," he said finally. "I'm a clerk at the Mercer's Company. My master, William Estfield, deals in wool and cloth. He has a warehouse near the Vintry and a house in Budge Row." Agnes didn't know why he was telling her this, but she nodded. William Estfield was a name she knew, one of the richest merchants in London, a man who had been sheriff and might someday be mayor. To work for such a man, even as a clerk, was a position of some status. "And you are," Edmund prompted. "Agnes Carpenter," she said. "I rent a room in Bread Street Ward." "And you're wondering how you'll pay your rent when the thaw comes," Edmund said. It was not a question. "You're wondering how you'll eat between now and then." Agnes felt a flash of anger at being seen through so easily, at having her desperation laid bare by a stranger. But she was too tired and too cold and too hungry to maintain the pride that would have made her turn away. "Yes," she said simply. Edmund nodded slowly, still looking at the ice. "There are opportunities, even in a time like this," he said. "Especially in a time like this. People are desperate for firewood, for food, for anything that will help them survive until spring. And they'll pay for it, those who can afford to at least." He turned to look at her directly. "There are boats on the far bank, small craft, that were moored there when the freeze came. They're full of supplies, coal, firewood, salted meat, that their owners can't reach now that the river is impassable. I've heard of enterprising souls crossing the ice, breaking into those boats, bringing supplies back to sell at the markets on this side." Agnes stared at him. "That's theft," she said. "It is," Edmund agreed. "But it's also survival. And before you judge too harshly, consider this. Those supplies are doing no one any good frozen in boats on the far bank. Their owners are likely dead or fled or unable to reach them anyway. And the people on this side of the river are dying for lack of fuel and food. Is it truly theft to take what no one else can use in order to save lives?" It was a sophistry, Agnes knew, the kind of argument that could justify almost anything. And yet she found herself considering it. She thought of the cold in her room, the hunger in her belly, the rent that would come due in less than 3 weeks. She thought of the child she had heard crying in the street, and the woman's voice saying there was no more bread. She thought of the winters ahead, assuming she survived this one, and the next time the river froze and the cold came, and she found herself alone and desperate again. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Edmund smiled slightly. "Because I think you're brave enough and desperate enough to try it," he said. "And because I need someone who can carry heavy loads and knows how to move quietly through the city. I have a master who depends on me, work I must do for him, and I cannot spend my days hauling firewood across the ice. But I can tell you where the boats are, which ones are least likely to be watched, and I can help you sell what you bring back, for a fair share of the profit, of course." "Of course," Agnes echoed. She should have been outraged. She should have walked away. Her mother had raised her to be honest, to work hard and keep her head down and trust that God would provide. But God had not provided. God had sent a winter that threatened to kill half the poor in London, and expecting him to change his mind seemed foolish at best. She looked out at the ice again, at the people walking on the frozen river as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She thought about climbing down those steps, about walking out onto that impossible white plain, about crossing to the far bank where the boats were locked in ice. She imagined breaking into one of those boats, filling a sack with coal or firewood, carrying it back across the ice to sell in Cheapside. She imagined the weight of coins in her hand, the taste of bread and meat, the feeling of warmth as she fed precious fuel into a fire in her room. "All right," she said, before she could change her mind. "Tell me where to go." Edmund had not expected her to agree so quickly. She saw surprise flicker across his face, followed by what might have been respect or might have been something more calculating. He pulled his cloak tighter against the wind and gestured toward the eastern part of the frozen river. "There's a cluster of wherries frozen near Queenhive," he said, keeping his voice low even though the nearest people were 50 yards away, absorbed in their own business on the ice. Small boats, the kind wherrymen used to ferry passengers and light cargo. They were carrying firewood and coal up from the docks when the freeze came. The owners, most of them live in Southwark or downriver, can't reach them, and the ice is too thick to break through with poles or axes. The boats are just sitting there, full of supplies no one can touch. "Except by walking across the ice," Agnes said. "Exactly." Edmund glanced around, then continued. "The trick is to go early in the morning, before dawn if you can manage it. The watch patrols the banks at night, looking for thieves who might try exactly what they're planning, but they're as cold and miserable as everyone else, and they don't venture onto the ice. Too dangerous in the dark, they say, afraid of weak spots. Go just before first light, when the watch is at its coldest and least alert, and you can cross without being seen." Agnes listened, her mind already racing ahead to the practical problems. "How do I get into the boats? Most of them aren't locked. Wherrymen don't bother usually. The boats themselves are locked by the ice, which is secure enough under normal circumstances. If you find one that is locked, well." He reached into his cloak and produced a small iron pry bar, heavy and cold when he pressed it into her hand. "This should manage most locks, and if not, the boat wasn't meant to be opened. Don't force it and risk breaking the tool or making noise that might draw attention." Agnes tucked the pry bar into her own cloak, feeling its weight settle against her ribs. The metal seemed to burn even through the layers of cloth, but whether with cold or with the shame of what she was about to do, she couldn't tell. "Once you have the supplies, bring them back to the North Bank," Edmund continued. "Not here at Queenhive. Too many people, too many questions. Bring them to the old dock at Broken Wharf." "Do you know it?" Agnes nodded. Broken Wharf was west of Queenhive, near the mouth of the Fleet River. It had been damaged in a storm years ago and never fully repaired. Few boats used it now, and the area around it was half abandoned, full of tumble-down warehouses and workshops that had seen better days. "Meet me there at sunrise," Edmund said. "I'll have a cart, and we'll take the supplies to someone I know who can sell them without asking too many questions. We'll split the proceeds, 60% for you, 40% for me. You take the greater risk, so you get the greater share. Does that seem fair?" Nothing about this seemed fair, Agnes thought. Nothing about stealing from boats frozen in ice, about profiting from other people's desperation, about becoming the kind of person her mother would have wept to see. But fairness had nothing to do with survival, and survival was the only thing that mattered now. "It seems fair," she said. Edmund studied her face for a long moment, and Agnes had the distinct feeling he was measuring her, weighing whether she would actually go through with it or whether she would lose her nerve and run back to her cold room to pray for forgiveness. She lifted her chin slightly and met his gaze, letting him see whatever he needed to see. "Good," he said finally. "Tomorrow morning, then. Before dawn." "And Agnes," he paused, and when he spoke again his voice was softer, almost kind. "Be careful on the ice. Stay away from the parts that look darker or clearer than the rest. That means the ice is thinner there. Keep away from where the water would normally flow fastest, near the bridge supports and where the river bends. And if you hear cracking, move quickly but don't run. Running can break ice that would hold you if you moved carefully." "How do you know all this?" Agnes asked. "My grandfather's stories," Edmund said. "And common sense. Ice is like anything else. It has its weaknesses and its strengths, and a clever person learns to tell them apart." He pulled up his hood. "Until tomorrow, then. And God keep you safe." He walked away before she could respond, making his way back up toward Cheapside with the confident stride of someone who had a warm house to return to. Agnes watched him go, then turned back to look at the ice. The sun was beginning to set, painting the frozen Thames in shades of pink and gold that made it look almost beautiful. Almost. But Agnes could see the darkness beneath the beauty, the boats trapped like dying creatures, the stillness where there should have been motion, the cold that radiated up from the ice like heat from a furnace in reverse. This was not a wonder to be marveled at. This was a catastrophe that happened to look pretty in the fading light. She made her way back to her room as darkness fell, walking quickly through streets that were emptying as people retreated indoors. The temperature was dropping again. She could feel it in the way the cold seemed to deepen, to settle more heavily on the city. By the time she reached Bread Street, her face was numb and her feet felt like blocks of wood inside her worn shoes. Robert Godwin was standing outside the chandler's shop when she arrived, arms crossed over his chest, breath puffing in clouds before his face. He was a heavy-set man in his 30s with small eyes and a petulant mouth, and he looked at Agnes with the expression of someone who had been waiting for her and was annoyed by the wait. "The rent's due in a fortnight," he said without preamble. 10 pence, same as always." "I know when the rent's due," Agnes said, trying to move past him toward the stairs that led to her room. "Do you have it?" Godwin demanded, shifting his bulk to block her path. Agnes felt anger flare in her chest, hot and sudden. "I said I know when it's due." "It's not due yet." "That's not an answer." Godwin's voice was flat. "Times are hard, Agnes. My business is suffering the same as everyone else's. I can't afford to have tenants who can't pay." "You'll get your money," Agnes said through gritted teeth. "Will I?" Godwin leaned closer, and she could smell the ale on his breath. "Because from where I stand, you look like a girl who hasn't got a penny to her name. No work, no prospects, winter just beginning. I could rent your room to someone more reliable. Someone who has a family to turn to if times get lean." "I'll have your money in a fortnight," Agnes repeated, her voice hard now. "And if you try to rent my room to someone else before then, I'll go to the ward moat and tell them how you tried to cheat your own father's tenant." It was a weak threat. The ward moat, the local assembly of citizens, would likely side with a property owner over a poor laundress, but it was enough to make Godwin step back slightly. He didn't like being reminded that people remembered his father, who had been well liked, or that his own reputation was considerably less sterling. "A fortnight," he said. "Not a day more. And if you can't pay, you're out. I don't care if it's snowing to bury the city." He turned and stumped back into his shop, slamming the door behind him. Agnes stood in the street for a moment, shaking, with cold, with anger, with the sudden crystallization of her situation into something sharp and undeniable. In a fortnight, she would need 10 pence. She had perhaps 6 pence left, and the price of bread was still climbing. Without the rent money, she would be homeless in the depths of winter, and being homeless in a London winter meant death as surely as falling through the ice. She climbed the stairs to her room, her legs heavy with exhaustion. The darkness inside was complete. She had no candle to spare for light, but she knew every inch of the space by heart. 4 paces from the door to the far wall, 3 paces from wall to wall. The pallet in the corner, the rope strung across for hanging clothes. The single window with its warped shutter that never quite closed properly. She sat on her pallet and pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them for warmth. The sheets she had washed were still hanging frozen, pale shapes in the darkness. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow before dawn she will go down to the river. She would cross the ice to those frozen wherries. She would break into them and take what she could carry. And she would try very hard not to think about what her mother would say if she could see her daughter now. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and full of dreams. She dreamed of her mother, healthy and strong as she had been before the fever, standing by the Thames in summer sunshine. But when Agnes tried to reach her, the river froze beneath her feet and her mother receded into the distance, becoming smaller and smaller until she was just a dark speck on the horizon. She dreamed of ice cracking beneath her, of dark water closing over her head, of being swept under the frozen surface while people walked above her, unaware and uncaring. She dreamed of a great frost that never ended, that spread across all of England, all of Christendom, turning the world into a vast white tomb. She woke in complete darkness, her heart pounding. For a moment she didn't know if she had slept for minutes or hours. Then she heard the bell of St. Paul's tolling in the distance, 4 bells, the hour before dawn. Time to go. Agnes stood, her body stiff with cold and the awkwardness of sleep. She wrapped herself in her cloak and pulled the hood low over her face. The pry bar Edmund had given her was still tucked inside her cloak, a cold weight against her side. She had nothing to carry supplies in. She would have to use her cloak, wrapping it around whatever she could take and carrying it bundle fashion. It would be awkward and obvious, but there was no help for it. The streets were utterly empty as she made her way toward the river. A few windows showed the faint glow of fire or rushlight from within, but most of the houses were dark and silent. The snow creaked under her feet, loud in the stillness. The cold was profound, a thing that seemed to have weight and presence, pressing against her like a living creature. At Queen High, she paused at the top of the stone steps leading down to the ice. The darkness was just beginning to fade at the edges, the sky lightening from black to deep gray. Below her, the frozen Thames stretched away into the gloom, a vast pale expanse that seemed to go on forever. She could just make out the shapes of boats trapped in the ice, dark against the white. No one else was visible. The watch, if they were still patrolling, were nowhere to be seen. Agnes took a deep breath, the cold air searing her lungs, and started down the steps. The ice, when her feet touched it, felt solid enough to be reassuring and uncertain enough to be terrifying. It bore her weight without groaning or cracking, but she could feel how it was not like walking on stone or packed earth. There was a slight give to it, a sense of something alive and dangerous beneath the frozen surface. She moved carefully, testing each step, aware of Edmund's warnings about dark patches and thin spots. The wherries were perhaps 100 yards from the shore, frozen in what would have been the main channel of the river. As Agnes drew closer, she could see them more clearly. Small boats, open-decked, meant for rowing rather than sailing. Some were tilted at odd angles where the ice had gripped them unevenly. Others sat relatively level, their oars still shipped, their benches dusted with snow. She approached the nearest one cautiously. It was perhaps 12 feet long, with a simple plank seat across the middle and open space fore and aft for cargo. And in that space, piled and covered with a canvas tarp stiff with frost, she could see what looked like bundles of wood. Agnes glanced around one more time. Still no one visible. Still no sound but the wind whistling across the ice, and then climbed carefully into the boat. The wood of the hull was slick with ice, and she had to move slowly to keep from slipping. The tarp crackled when she pulled it back, breaking apart the ice that had formed on its folds. Firewood, bundles of it, split logs tied with rope, ready for sale. Her hands shook as she reached for the nearest bundle, and not entirely from the cold. This was the moment. Once she took this wood, once she carried it back to the north bank, she would be a thief. Not in her own mind, perhaps, where she could justify it as survival, as necessity, as taking from those who had lost to give to those in need. But in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of God, if he was watching, she would be a thief. She closed her hands around the bundle. The wood was frozen, the rope around it stiff with ice. It was heavier than she expected, perhaps 30 pounds of oak and ash. She could carry one bundle at a time, maybe two if she was strong enough. She would need to make multiple trips, which meant more risk, more chances of being seen. But she had no choice. She had never had a choice. Agnes lifted the bundle out of the wherry and onto the ice. Then she went back for a second, grunting with the effort. 2 bundles of firewood. Enough to sell for, what, 6 pence if she was lucky. More if the cold continued, and people grew more desperate. She didn't know the market for stolen goods, and had never imagined she would need to know it. She was tying the bundles together with a length of rope she found in the boat, preparing to drag them across the ice, when she heard the voice. "Who's there?" Agnes froze. The voice came from somewhere to her left, maybe 50 yards away, male and sharp with authority. The watch. It had to be the watch. "Show yourself," the voice called. "No one's allowed on the ice at night." Agnes's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She could see him now, a dark figure approaching across the ice, carrying what looked like a staff or pole. If he caught her with the stolen wood, she would be arrested, tried before the alderman, possibly hanged, though more likely she would lose a hand or be branded on the face. Theft was taken seriously in London, especially in hard times when everyone was desperate and the authorities needed to make examples. She left the bundles where they were and ran. The ice was treacherous, slippery in places, rough in others. Agnes ran in a crouch, trying to stay low, trying to make herself as small a target as possible. Behind her she could hear the watchman shouting, his voice growing louder as he gave chase. But he was slower than she was, older, heavier, burdened with his staff and cloak. She was young and desperate, and had spent her whole life moving through the crowded streets of London, dodging carts and horses and people. She knew how to run. She made it to the North Bank and scrambled up the stone steps at Broken Wharf, her hands scrabbling for purchase on the icy stone. At the top, she risked a glance back. The watchman had stopped at the base of the steps, breathing hard, his face red with exertion and anger in the growing light. "I know your face," he shouted up at her. "I'll remember you. You'll hang for this." Agnes didn't wait to hear more. She ran into the maze of streets around the Vintry, running until her lungs burned and her legs felt like they might give out, until she was sure she had lost him in the warren of alleys and lanes. Only then did she stop, leaning against a wall, gasping for breath, her whole body shaking. She had failed. Worse than failed, she had been seen, recognized possibly, by a watchman who now knew someone was robbing the frozen boats. He would tell the other watchmen, and they would watch more carefully. The opportunity Edmund had described might be gone now, and all she had to show for her risk was terror and exhaustion and empty hands. The sky was lightening steadily now, the darkness giving way to the gray half-light that passed for morning in this frozen December. Agnes made her way slowly back to Bread Street, taking a roundabout path, checking constantly to make sure she wasn't being followed. Every person she saw, and there were more now as the city began to wake, seemed to be looking at her with suspicion. Every shadow seemed to hold a watchman ready to grab her. It took all her courage not to simply run blindly for the false safety of her room. When she finally reached her door, she found Edmund waiting for her. He was standing in the doorway of the chandler's shop, arms crossed, face hidden in his hood. Agnes's first thought was that he had betrayed her, that he had sent word to the watch, that this had all been some elaborate trap. But when he stepped forward and she saw his face, she saw only concern. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "I waited at Broken Wharf until sunrise, and you never came." Agnes told him, her voice low and rapid, glancing around constantly to make sure no one was listening. She described the wherries full of firewood, the bundles she had taken out of the boat, the watchman appearing out of nowhere, her desperate flight across the ice. Edmund listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "The watchman," he said finally. "Did he get close enough to see your face clearly?" Agnes tried to remember. "I don't think so. It was still dark. But he said he would remember me." "They always say that," Edmund said. "It's meant to frighten." But in the darkness, from 50 yards away on the ice, he saw a figure in a cloak. "That could be half the women in London." He paused. "Did he see what you took?" "The wood was still there when I ran. I didn't have time to bring it." Edmund nodded slowly. "That might work in our favor. If there's no stolen goods, there's no proof of crime. Just someone on the ice at night, which is foolish but not illegal. Unless he actually catches you with something taken from those boats, he has nothing." "So what do we do?" Agnes asked. She was still shaking, though whether from cold or fear or the aftermath of running, she couldn't tell. "We wait," Edmund said. "A day or two, until the watch relaxes their vigilance. They can't patrol the entire frozen river constantly. There's too much of it and too few of them. And meanwhile, people are still desperate. The cold isn't ending. If anything, it's getting worse. The demand for firewood and coal will only increase." He looked at her directly. "The question is whether you have the courage to try again." Agnes thought about her 6 remaining pennies. About the rent due in less than 2 weeks. About the cold in her room that would only get worse. About the hunger that was already making her lightheaded. About the long winter stretching ahead with no end in sight. She thought about her mother, dead in a cold room because they couldn't afford a doctor or even enough firewood to keep her warm in her fever. She thought about the watchman's shout, "You'll hang for this," and the terror that had filled her as she ran across the ice. And then she thought about the alternative, about begging in the streets, which would likely lead to arrest as a vagrant. About the workhouse, which was said to be worse than prison. About slowly starving in her room while the world froze around her. About Robert Godwin throwing her out into the snow with nowhere to go and no one to help her. "I'll try again," she said. Edmund's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested approval. "Good," he said. "But we'll be smarter this time. We'll wait 3 days, long enough for the watch to grow complacent, to convince themselves that whoever they frightened off won't return. And we'll choose a different location, farther downriver where they won't expect anyone to try." "Farther downriver means a longer walk back across the ice," Agnes said. "More time exposed, more chance of being seen." "True," Edmund acknowledged. "But it also means boats that are less watched, less picked over. And I have an idea about how to make the return journey safer." He glanced around, then lowered his voice. "There's a fishmonger I know, Thomas Marsh, who has a warehouse near Billingsgate. He's an enterprising man, not particular about where his goods come from as long as the price is right. He has a cart he uses for his business, and for a share of the profits, he might be convinced to meet us on the ice itself. We load the cart, He transports everything back to his warehouse, and we divide the proceeds there. No carrying bundles through the streets. No suspicious-looking woman with stolen firewood. It made sense, Agnes had to admit. What share would he want? 20%, perhaps 25%. It reduces our profit, but it also reduces our risk considerably. Agnes did the calculations in her head. If they could take, 6 bundles of firewood. 8. Sell them at current prices, which were at least 4 pence per bundle, probably more. Even with Edmund's 40% and the fishmonger's share, she would still have enough for rent and food for another month. Maybe longer if the cold drove prices even higher. All right, she said. 3 days. Where do we meet? I'll send word, Edmund said. Stay in your room as much as you can. Don't go near the river. If anyone asks questions, you've been ill with a cough and haven't left your lodgings. Can you manage that? Agnes nodded. It wouldn't be difficult. She had nowhere else to go and no reason to venture out except to buy food, which she would need to do sparingly given her dwindling coins. Good. Edmund pulled a small cloth bundle from inside his cloak. Take this. Just bread and cheese, nothing fancy. But you look half-starved and I need you strong for the work ahead. Agnes took the bundle, her pride warring with her hunger. The hunger won. Thank you, she said quietly. Thank me when we're both richer, Edmund said. Until then, be careful. Trust no one. And if the watch comes asking questions, you know nothing about any boats or any firewood. You're just a poor laundress trying to survive the winter like everyone else. He left then, disappearing into the awakening streets. Agnes climbed the stairs to her room, clutching the bundle of food. Once inside, she sat on her pallet and unwrapped it with shaking hands. A half-loaf of brown bread, hard but edible. A wedge of cheese, yellow and sharp-smelling. Her mouth watered at the sight of it. She forced herself to eat slowly, to make it last, though everything in her wanted to devour it all at once. The bread was tough and required considerable chewing, but it was the best thing she had tasted in days. The cheese was strong and salty and made her desperately thirsty, but she had no water except what she could melt from snow, and snow water had a flat, dead taste that never quite satisfied. When she had eaten half of what Edmund had given her, she carefully wrapped the rest and tucked it into the corner of her room where the mice were less likely to find it. Then she lay down on her pallet, exhausted despite the early hour, and tried to sleep. The 3 days that followed were among the longest of Agnes's life. She left her room only twice, once to buy a penny's worth of bread from a baker on Cheapside, once to fetch water from the public conduit. Both times she moved quickly, keeping her head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might remember her face. The cold, if anything, was intensifying. People on the streets moved like shadows, hunched and hurried, their faces wrapped in cloth against the bitter wind. The markets were half empty. The few vendors who remained were selling their goods at prices that made Agnes's eyes water. 6 pence for a loaf that would have cost 1 pence a month ago. 8 pence for a bundle of kindling that should have been 3. She heard stories, fragments of conversation caught as she passed. A child had frozen to death in Cripplegate Ward, they said, in a room with no fire and no food. An old man had been found in the morning on Cornhill, sitting against a wall as though resting, frozen solid. The hospitals and alehouses that normally offered shelter to the desperate were overwhelmed, turning people away. The monasteries were still providing soup and bread, but the lines grew longer each day and the portions smaller. And the Thames remained frozen, a vast white highway that people crossed now with growing confidence. Some enterprising souls had set up a proper market on the ice near London Bridge, stalls selling hot food and drink, vendors hawking goods, even a tent where a priest was offering to say masses for those who would pay. It was macabre, Agnes thought, this festival atmosphere over what was essentially a catastrophe. But she understood it too. People needed to believe that life continued, that this was just another hardship to be endured rather than the end of the world. On the evening of the 3rd day, a boy came to her door. He was perhaps 10 years old, with a pinched face and clothes too thin for the weather, the kind of child who ran errands for pennies and would never ask questions if told not to. "Message for Agnes Carpenter," he said when she opened the door. "I'm Agnes." The boy recited what he had obviously memorized. "Tomorrow morning. Before dawn, the dock at Billingsgate. Come alone. Wear dark clothes." He paused, then added, "The man who sent me gave me a farthing and said you'd give me another." Agnes didn't have a farthing to spare, but she found a halfpenny and pressed it into the boy's grimy palm. His eyes widened, clearly more than he'd expected, and he scurried away before she could change her mind. Tomorrow, then. Agnes spent the rest of the evening preparing as best she could. She had no dark clothes. Her cloak was brown, her kirtle a faded gray that had once been blue, but she rubbed soot from the chandler's shop onto the visible parts to darken them. She wrapped her hands and feet in extra layers of cloth, knowing that the cold before dawn would be even more brutal than usual. She ate the last of the bread and cheese Edmund had given her, needing the strength. And she prayed. Not in church. She couldn't spare the time or the exposure, but kneeling by her pallet in the darkness, her breath forming clouds before her face. She prayed to God, to the Virgin Mary, to St. Catherine, who was the patron of working women, to anyone who might be listening. She prayed not to be caught, not to fall through the ice, not to freeze to death on the river. She prayed for forgiveness for what she was about to do and for the strength to do it anyway. And she prayed, though she knew it was selfish, that if someone had to suffer for her survival, let it be someone else, someone who could afford it. As she didn't sleep, she lay on her pallet and watched the darkness slowly fade from her window, and when the bell of St. Paul's rang 4 times in the distance, she rose and wrapped herself in her cloak and stepped out into the frozen city. The streets were utterly silent. No watchman called out the hour, no drunks stumbled home from taverns, no beggars huddled in doorways, or if they did, they were too frozen to move or cry out. The only sound was the crunch of Agnes's feet on the packed snow and the whistle of wind through the narrow lanes. The cold was like a living thing, a presence that wrapped around her and squeezed, that found every gap in her clothing and every crack in her resolve. Billingsgate lay on the north bank of the Thames, east of London Bridge, where in better times the fishing boats would unload their catches and the merchants would haggle over prices. Now it was deserted, the docks empty, the warehouses dark. Agnes found the meeting place, a stone dock that extended out over what was now the ice, and waited. She didn't have to wait long. Two figures emerged from the darkness, moving carefully across the frozen surface. Edmund she recognized immediately. The other man was shorter and broader, with a thick beard and a cloak that bulged over what must have been substantial layers of clothing beneath. "Agnes," Edmund greeted her quietly. "This is Thomas Marsh." The fishmonger looked her up and down with an appraising eye. "You're smaller than I expected," he said. His voice was rough, the voice of someone who spent his days shouting over crowds at the fish market. "Are you sure you can haul heavy loads?" "I've been hauling laundry since I was 7 years old," Agnes said, keeping her voice level. "I'm stronger than I look." Marsh grunted. "You'd better be. Edmund says there's good profit in this, but only if we can move enough volume to make the risk worthwhile." He gestured behind him, and Agnes saw what she hadn't noticed before, a small handcart on the ice, the kind market vendors used, with 2 wheels and handles for pushing or pulling. "The cart can hold 8 bundles easily, maybe 10 if we stack carefully," Marsh continued. "We go downriver, past the bridge, to where the wherries cluster near the tower. Less traffic down there, fewer eyes watching. We load up, bring everything back here, and I transport it to my warehouse. I sell the goods through my usual channels, no questions asked, no names given. We split the proceeds, 40% for me, 30 for Edmund, 30 for you." "Agreed." It was less than Edmund had initially offered, but Agnes was in no position to negotiate. "Agreed," she said. "Then let's move," Marsh said. "We've got maybe an hour before the sky starts to lighten properly, and we need to be off the ice by then." They set off across the frozen Thames, moving east toward the Tower of London. The cart rattled and bumped over the uneven ice, and Agnes winced at every sound, certain it would bring watchmen running. But the night remained silent except for their footsteps and the wind. The tower loomed ahead of them, a dark mass of stone against the slightly lighter sky. The wherries frozen near it were smaller than the ones at Queenhithe. Agnes saw personal boats, perhaps, or the vessels of independent watermen who worked the eastern stretches of the river. They approached the nearest one carefully, and Marsh climbed in while Edmund and Agnes kept watch. "Firewood," Marsh called softly. "Good quality oak." And there was a pause, then a satisfied grunt. "Coal. 2 sacks of it. This is better than I hoped." They worked quickly and quietly, passing bundles of wood and the precious sacks of coal from the boat to the ice, loading everything onto the cart. Agnes's hands were numb within minutes, despite the cloth wrapped around them, and her shoulders ached from the lifting and carrying. But she didn't stop, didn't slow down. This was what she had come for. This was survival. They had just finished loading the cart, 10 bundles of wood and the 2 sacks of coal, a treasure trove in this frozen winter, when Agnes heard the sound that had haunted her nightmares since her first attempt. Voices coming from the direction of the tower. "The watch," Edmund hissed. "And move. Now." They began pushing the cart back toward Billingsgate, moving as quickly as they dared. But the cart was heavy, and the ice was treacherous, and the voices behind them were growing louder. Agnes could hear individual words now. Saw something. Lights. Down by the boats. Faster, Marsh growled, throwing his weight against the cart. Agnes grabbed one handle, Edmund the other, and they pushed together, their feet slipping and sliding on the ice. The cart lurched forward, wheels catching on rough patches, bundles of wood shifting and threatening to fall. Behind them, the voices had become shouts. "Stop! In the name of the king!" "Don't stop," Marsh panted. "Just keep moving. They won't shoot. Too dark. Too risky hitting innocent people if anyone else is on the ice." Agnes's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Her legs were screaming with effort. Her lungs burned from the cold air. But she pushed, throwing everything she had into moving that cart, into putting distance between them and the watchmen. They were perhaps halfway back to Billingsgate when disaster struck. The cart hit a patch of rough ice, a ridge where 2 sections had frozen at different heights, and one wheel caught. The cart lurched sideways, tipped, and crashed onto the ice. Bundles of wood went rolling. One of the coal sacks split, black dust spreading across the white surface. "Leave it," Edmund gasped. "We have to leave it and run." "The hell we do," Marsh snarled. He was already gathering bundles, shoving them back onto the cart. "This is money. This is your life if you stay here," Edmund interrupted. He grabbed Agnes's arm. "Come on. We tried. It's not worth hanging for." But Agnes was looking at the spilled coal, at the bundles of wood scattered across the ice, at all that wealth just lying there. She thought of her room, of the cold, of Robert Godwin's threat, of the rent due in 10 days. She thought of the long winter ahead and all the winters after that, assuming she lived through this one. She pulled free from Edmund's grip and started gathering wood. "Are you mad?" Edmund demanded. "Probably," Agnes said through gritted teeth. She had 2 bundles now, 3. Marsh had righted the cart and was loading it again with frantic speed. The watchmen were getting closer. She could see their shapes now, dark against the ice, perhaps 100 yards away. 4 bundles, 5. The torn coal sack, gathered up and tied shut with a strip of cloth torn from her kirtle. 6 bundles. "That's enough," Marsh said. "Go. Both of you. I'll get the cart to shore." "We go together," Agnes said. She had no idea where the words came from, no idea why she felt this sudden fierce loyalty to a fishmonger she'd met an hour ago. but something in her refused to leave him to face the watch alone. Edmund swore, a vicious, creative string of profanity that would have shocked Agnes in other circumstances, and grabbed the cart handle. "Then move," he snarled. They ran, not the mad, desperate sprint that Agnes had managed on her first attempt, but a grinding, agonizing push against the weight of the cart, fighting for every foot of progress. The ice was rough here, ridged and uneven, and the cart bucked and fought them like a living thing. Agnes's hands slipped on the handle. Her feet found no purchase. She fell once hard, her knee cracking against the ice with a pain that brought tears to her eyes. But she scrambled up and grabbed the cart again and pushed. The watchmen were close now. Close enough that Agnes could hear their breathing, could hear one of them saying, "Got them now. Can't outrun us with that cart." And then they were at the bank. The stone dock at Billingsgate was just ahead, and beyond it the narrow streets where the watch would have a harder time following. "Up," Marsh grunted. Between the three of them, they manhandled the cart up onto the dock, bundles sliding and threatening to fall again. Agnes's muscles were screaming. Her vision was starting to blur at the edges. She grabbed two bundles and ran into the maze of streets, not looking back to see if Edmund and Marsh were following, trusting that they were. She ran until she couldn't run anymore, until her legs simply refused to carry her another step. She collapsed in an alley between a warehouse and a cooper's shop, still clutching the bundles of wood, gasping for breath. A moment later, Edmund appeared, dragging the cart with Marsh pushing from behind. They were both breathing hard, faces red with exertion. "Did they follow?" Agnes managed to ask. "Don't think so," Marsh wheezed. "Lost them in the streets. They don't know the lanes like we do." They sat in silence for a few minutes, just breathing, letting their hearts slow down. The sky was definitely lightening now. They had perhaps 20 minutes before full dawn. They needed to move, to get the cart to Marsh's warehouse, and divide up the goods before the streets filled with people. "That," Edmund said finally, "was the stupidest, most reckless thing I've ever seen anyone do." "But we got the goods," Marsh pointed out. He was grinning, Agnes saw with surprise, actually grinning, as though this had been some kind of adventure rather than a near disaster. 6 bundles of wood and a sack and a half of coal. At current prices, that's what, 30 pence? 40. If we can sell it without getting caught, Edmund said darkly. But he too looked pleased, Agnes noticed. There was something in his face, excitement, pride maybe, the satisfaction of having pulled off something difficult and dangerous. And Agnes, despite the exhaustion, despite the pain in her knee and her hands and her shoulders, despite the terror that was only now beginning to fade, felt something unexpected rising in her chest. Not quite pride. She was still too aware of what she had done, of the line she had crossed. But something close to it, something that felt almost like triumph. They moved through the awakening streets to Marsh's warehouse, a long, low building near the fish market that smelled powerfully of the sea even in the midst of winter. Inside it was marginally warmer than outside. The stone walls held some heat, and darker, lit only by the gray light filtering through high windows. Marsh had them stack the wood and coal in a corner, then covered it all with canvas. "I'll sell it today," he said. "Easy enough to claim. I had it stored here from before the freeze. Come back tomorrow evening, after dark, mind you, and I'll have your money." "Tomorrow," Edmund agreed. He looked at Agnes. "Can you find your way back? You shouldn't be seen with me. If anyone's looking for people involved in what happened on the river, it's better if we're not connected." Agnes nodded. She could find her way from Billingsgate to Bread Street blindfolded. She had walked these lanes all her life. "Be careful," Edmund said quietly. "And Agnes, you did well. Better than I expected." It was the closest thing to a compliment she had received in years. Agnes felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. "Thank you," she managed. She left the warehouse and made her way home through streets that were beginning to fill with people. She kept her head down, her cloak wrapped tight, just another poor woman in a city full of poor women. No one looked at her twice. No one seemed to notice the soot on her clothes or the tears in her kirtle, where she had ripped a strip to tie the coal sack. When she reached her room, she collapsed on her pallet and slept for 10 hours straight, a deep, exhausted sleep without dreams. When she woke, it was afternoon, and the cold had, if anything, intensified. She could see ice forming on the inside of her walls, delicate fern-like patterns that would have been beautiful if they hadn't been a sign of how desperately cold it was. But she had done it. She had crossed the frozen Thames, stolen from the trapped boats, and escaped the watch. And tomorrow she would have money, real money, enough for rent and food and maybe even some coal to warm her room. She had survived. She had done what she needed to do to survive. And if that made her a thief, well. The winter had made thieves of many people. At least she was a thief who would live to see spring. The next evening, Agnes returned to Marsh's warehouse as instructed, approaching from the east through a series of narrow alleys she had scouted during the day. The sky was fully dark now, the stars hidden behind a thick blanket of cloud that promised more snow. The cold had not relented. If anything, it seemed to deepen with each passing night, as though winter itself was tightening its grip on the city with deliberate malice. She found Edmund already waiting in the shadows near the warehouse door. He nodded to her but said nothing, and together they slipped inside. Marsh was counting coins by the light of a single candle, his broad fingers surprisingly nimble as they sorted through piles of pennies and farthings. He looked up when they entered, and his bearded face split in a satisfied smile. "Sold every stick of it," he said without preamble. "The wood went for 5 pence a bundle. Would have been 6, but I had to move it quickly and quietly. The coal I sold to an apothecary's wife on Thames Street for 12 pence. All told, 42 pence. Agnes's breath caught. 42 pence. It was more than she usually made in 3 months. 40% for me is 17 pence, Marsh continued, counting out coins. That leaves 25 pence for you two to split. 12 pence each, and 1 left over. He pushed the remaining penny toward Agnes. You earned that. You kept your head when it mattered. Agnes stared at the coins, 12 pennies plus the extra one. 13 pence. It was enough for rent with 3 pence left over. Enough for food for 3 weeks, maybe 4 if she was careful. Enough to pay Robert Godwin and still have something in reserve for the long winter ahead. There's more where this came from, Marsh said, looking between them. The river's still frozen solid. Will be for weeks if this cold keeps up. There are dozens of boats out there, full of goods no one can reach. We were cautious tonight, took only what we could carry quickly but with better planning. No, Edmund interrupted. We were lucky tonight. Lucky the watch didn't catch us. Lucky we didn't fall through the ice. Lucky we got away. Push our luck again and we'll hang. Maybe, Marsh conceded. But people are desperate, Edmund. Getting more desperate every day. I could sell 10 times what we brought back tonight, and at even better prices. The demand is there. So is the danger, Edmund said firmly. We take a rest. Let the watch relax again. Let people forget. Maybe in a week, maybe 2. In a week or 2, the ice might be picked clean by others with the same idea, Marsh argued. In a week or 2, the watch might have doubled their patrols. We have an opportunity now tonight, while people are still learning to trust the ice, while the watch is still. I'll do it, Agnes heard herself say. Both men turned to look at her. I'll go out again, she continued, her voice steadier than she felt. Tomorrow night. Or the night after. Whenever you think it's safe enough. I need the money. It was the simple truth. 13 pence would keep her alive for a few weeks, but then what? The winter would still be here. The cold would still be crushing. She would be back where she started, only with more snow on the ground and fewer resources to survive it. Edmund was shaking his head. Agnes, be reasonable. You saw what happened tonight. We barely. I was there, Agnes interrupted. I know what happened. I'm not saying it wasn't dangerous. I'm saying I'm willing to take the risk. She looked at Marsh. You said you could sell more. How much more? As much as we can bring back, Marsh said, his eyes gleaming in the candlelight. If we could manage 3 trips, 4 even, over the next week while the cold holds. 3 trips is suicide, Edmund said flatly. The watch will be looking for us specifically now. They'll have descriptions. They'll be patrolling more heavily. Then we change our approach, Agnes said. An idea was forming in her mind, born of desperation, but taking on a shape that seemed almost sensible. We don't go to the same places. We don't use the same routes. We go in different directions each time, west one night, east the next. We vary the times. And she paused, thinking it through. We look like we belong there. Not thieves sneaking around in the dark, but honest people with legitimate business on the ice. And how exactly do we do that? Edmund asked, but his tone suggested he was listening at least. The market on the ice, Agnes said. Near London Bridge. I've heard people talking about it. Vendors selling goods, people buying and selling, setting up tents even. What if we join them? Set up our own stall during the day, sell whatever we can find or make, become familiar faces. Then at night, we go to the boats. If anyone sees us, we're just vendors from the ice market, moving our goods, getting supplies. Nothing suspicious about it. Marsh was nodding slowly. That could work. That could actually work. During the day, we're visible, respectable, just trying to make a living like everyone else. At night, we supplement our legitimate goods with goods that are equally legitimate, just acquired through less conventional means. It's still dangerous, Edmund said, but Agnes could hear the shift in his voice. He was considering it. Everything is dangerous right now, Agnes said. Walking across the ice is dangerous. Staying in a room with no fire is dangerous. Going hungry is dangerous. At least this danger comes with a reward. Edmund was quiet for a long moment, his face shadowed in the dim candlelight. Finally he sighed. I must be mad, he said. But all right. We try it, one more trip in 2 nights. If that goes well, we consider continuing. If it goes badly, we run very fast, Marsh finished with a grin. The same as tonight. They divided the rest of the coins and made plans for the next attempt. Agnes left the warehouse with 13 pence carefully hidden in a small cloth bag tied around her waist, beneath her kirtle where no pickpocket could reach it. The weight of the coins against her skin was reassuring, solid proof that what she had done was real, that the risk had been worth it. She stopped at a baker's shop on her way home, one of the few still open in the evening, and bought a whole loaf of bread, fresh and warm, for 2 pence. The baker, a round-faced woman with flour in her hair, wrapped it in cloth and looked at Agnes with tired kindness. You look half-frozen, dearie, she said. Are you taking care of yourself? As best I can, Agnes said. The warmth of the shop, the smell of baking bread, the simple human kindness in the woman's voice, it was almost too much. She felt tears prickling at her eyes and blinked them back hastily. These are hard times, the baker said more gently. But we endure. We always endure. Take your bread and get yourself home before you freeze. Agnes nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and hurried out into the cold. Back in her room, she ate half the loaf while it was still warm, tearing into it with a hunger that went beyond the physical. Each bite was warmth and comfort, and the promise of continued survival. When she had eaten her fill, actually full, for the first time in weeks, she wrapped the remaining bread carefully and set it aside. Then she took out the coins and counted them again, running her fingers over the cold metal, making sure they were real. Tomorrow she will pay Robert Godwin his rent. She would pay it early, in fact, just to see the surprise on his face. She would buy more food, not luxuriously, but enough to sustain her. And she would prepare for the next venture onto the ice, for the next theft, for whatever she needed to do to survive this winter. Her mother would have been ashamed. Joan had been an honest woman, proud of her hard work and her integrity even in poverty. She had taught Agnes that there was dignity in labor, in earning one's bread through legitimate means, in keeping one's conscience clear before God. And here was Agnes, spending stolen money, planning her next theft, becoming exactly the kind of person her mother had warned her about. But her mother was dead, Agnes thought with a hardness that surprised her. Dead and buried in an unmarked grave because honesty and hard work hadn't been enough to save her from fever and poverty and a London winter. Agnes was alive, and if staying alive meant crossing lines her mother would never have crossed, then so be it. The dead could afford principles. The living had to be more practical. She lay down on her pallet, wrapped in her cloak and her blanket, with her remaining bread beside her and her coins hidden beneath her clothes. Outside, the wind howled through the streets and the temperature continued to drop. But Agnes, for the first time in weeks, felt something that wasn't quite hope but was close to it. A sense that maybe, just maybe, she could survive this, that she was stronger and more capable than she had known, that she could do what needed to be done. Sleep came easier that night, though her dreams were troubled. She dreamed of walking across endless expanses of ice, always searching for something she couldn't name. She dreamed of her mother standing on the far shore, too distant to reach. She dreamed of dark water beneath white ice, and voices calling from below, and hands reaching up through cracks toward a sky they would never touch. But when she woke in the gray morning light, she found herself thinking not of the dreams but of the plan. 2 nights from now, they would go back onto the ice. In the meantime, she had preparations to make. She rose and dressed, wrapping herself against the cold. Then she took 3 of her precious pennies and ventured out into the frozen city. Her first stop was Cheapside, where she found a peddler selling old clothes and rags from a handcart. She bought a man's cloak for 2 pence, worn and patched but thick and dark, the kind of garment that would help her blend into shadows. The peddler gave her a curious look, but asked no questions. Money was money, and in times like these, no one inquired too closely into anyone else's business. Her second purchase was from a boy selling bits of scavenged rope and cord near the stocks market. She bought several lengths of strong hemp rope for a handful of farthings, ignoring the boy's obvious curiosity about what a woman alone would want with rope. Finally, she stopped at St. Paul's Cathedral, not to pray but to observe. The great church was one of the few places in London where people of all classes mingled, where a poor laundress could stand beside a wealthy merchant without drawing undue attention. She watched the people coming and going, studying their movements, their clothing, how they carried themselves. She was learning to see what the watchmen would see, to understand what looked suspicious and what looked ordinary. A woman alone on the ice at night looked suspicious. But a woman with others, moving purposefully, dressed appropriately for trade, that might look ordinary enough to escape notice. It was all in the details, in the performance of normalcy. She returned to her room and spent the afternoon preparing. She practiced walking in the man's cloak, getting used to its weight and bulk. She tested different ways of tying the rope, of making bundles that could be carried easily and quickly. She planned routes in her mind, drawing on her lifetime knowledge of London streets and lanes, thinking about where the watch would patrol and where they wouldn't, where shadows fell deepest and where escape routes existed. By evening, she had a headache from concentration, and her hands were sore from practicing knots, but she felt ready, or as ready as she would ever be. The next day, she paid her rent. Robert Godwin opened his door with a scowl, clearly ready to make some comment about her poverty or her prospects. But when she counted out 10 pence into his palm, the full month's rent, paid 8 days early, his expression shifted from contempt to confusion to reluctant respect. "I told you I'd have it," Agnes said, keeping her voice neutral. "So you did," Godwin said slowly. He was clearly wondering where she had gotten the money, but he was too pleased to have it to ask many questions. "Business picked up, has it?" "Something like that," Agnes said. She turned to leave, then paused. "I'll have next month's rent on time, too. You don't need to worry about me." It was a small victory, a tiny reclamation of dignity. But as she climbed the stairs to her room, Agnes felt taller somehow, stronger. She had earned that respect through theft, yes, but she had earned it nonetheless. And in a world where women like her were usually invisible, being seen, even as a tenant who paid her rent on time, felt like a kind of triumph. That night she ate well, more bread, some cheese she had bought from a dairyman, even a small pie from a cookshop, meat and gravy wrapped in pastry that was still warm. She went to bed with a full stomach and money still in her possession, two things she had not had simultaneously in longer than she could remember. Tomorrow night they will return to the ice. Tomorrow night she would steal again, would risk the watch and the cold and the possibility of falling through into the dark water below. But tonight she was warm enough and fed enough and safe enough, and that would have to be sufficient. The winter pressed down on London like a great stone, grinding and relentless. But Agnes was still here, still breathing, still fighting. And that, she was beginning to understand, was its own kind of victory. Not the victory of goodness over evil or righteousness over sin, but the simpler, harder victory of survival over death, of refusing to lie down and freeze, of doing whatever it took to see another dawn. Her mother might not have understood. But then, her mother had never had to make such choices. Joan had died before the world could force her to compromise her principles, and perhaps that was a mercy of sorts. Agnes would never know that mercy. She would have to live with what she had become, with what the winter was making of her. But she would live. That was the thing she returned to again and again, as she lay in the darkness and listened to the wind howl. She would live. Whatever it cost, whatever it required, she would survive this winter. And perhaps that was all the redemption she could hope for, not to be good but to endure, not to be pure but to persist. Sleep came eventually, deep and dreamless, and when she woke to the sound of scent, Paul's bell ringing in the frozen dawn, Agnes rose and prepared herself for what was to come, for the choices she would make and the lines she would cross, for the ice and the dark and the desperate work of staying alive in a world that seemed determined to kill her. The day passed slowly. Agnes forced herself to eat to rest, to conserve her strength for the night ahead. She checked her preparations: the rope, the dark cloak, the strips of cloth to wrap her hands. She went over the plan in her mind again and again until she could have recited it in her sleep. West tonight, Edmund had said. Toward Westminster, where fewer boats clustered but the watch was thinner. A longer walk across the ice but a better chance of success. As darkness fell and the temperature plummeted, Agnes wrapped herself in her preparations like armor. The man's cloak over her own. The rope coiled and ready. Her face set in an expression of grim determination that would have surprised anyone who knew her only as the quiet laundress from Bread Street. She left her room and made her way through the frozen streets, a shadow among shadows, one more desperate soul trying to survive in a winter that seemed to have no end. The meeting place tonight was different, a tumble-down warehouse near the mouth of the Fleet River, where the smaller tributary joined the Thames. Agnes arrived first, waiting in the darkness beside a wall whose timbers had rotted to the point of near collapse. She could smell the fleet even in the freezing cold, that distinctive reek of waste and decay that marked London's most polluted waterway. In summer the stench was unbearable. Now it was merely unpleasant, muted by the ice that had locked even this foul stream in its grip. Edmund appeared from the direction of Ludgate, moving quietly despite the snow. He nodded to Agnes but said nothing, his face barely visible within his hood. A few minutes later Marsh arrived, pulling a different cart this time, smaller, with cloth wrapped around the wheels to muffle their sound. "Ready?" Marsh asked quietly. Agnes and Edmund both nodded. They descended to the ice together, a route Marsh had scouted during the day. The slope here was gentler than at the formal docks, and the cart came down easily enough. Once on the frozen surface they paused, letting their eyes adjust to the darkness, listening for any sounds that might indicate the watch was near. Nothing, only the wind and the vast silence of the frozen river. They began walking west, keeping close to the north bank where the darkness was deepest. The ice here was rougher than it had been downriver, ridged and uneven, and they had to move carefully to avoid twisting an ankle or catching the cart wheels on a jutting edge. Above them, the city rose in dark masses of timber and stone, only a few windows showing the dim glow of firelight or candles. Most of London was already abed, huddling beneath whatever coverings they possessed, trying to survive another night. Agnes found herself thinking about all those people in all those rooms, each one fighting their own private battle against the cold and hunger and despair. How many would survive until spring? How many would freeze or starve or simply give up? How many were, even now, making the same desperate choices she was making? Crossing lines they had never imagined crossing, becoming people they had never thought they would be. It took nearly half an hour of careful walking to reach the area Marsh had identified, a stretch of river near Westminster, where several wherries and small barges had been caught by the freeze. They were farther from shore here, frozen in what would have been the deeper channel, and approaching them meant venturing out onto ice that Agnes couldn't help but imagine as thinner, weaker, more treacherous. But there was no help for it. They left the cart near the bank, thinking it would be faster to make multiple trips carrying bundles than to risk taking the cart across questionable ice, and began making their way toward the nearest boat. Agnes went first, testing each step, listening for the sounds Edmund had warned her about, the creaking and groaning that would signal weakness. But the ice here seemed solid enough, and within a few minutes she had reached the first wherry. It was larger than the ones they had robbed before, perhaps 20 feet long, with a small covered area at the stern where a wherryman might store personal belongings or shelter from rain. The main cargo space was open, and even in the darkness Agnes could see bundles stacked and covered with canvas. She climbed carefully into the boat, her feet slipping slightly on the iced-over planks. Edmund and Marsh followed, and together they pulled back the canvas. "Christ's bones," Marsh breathed. The boat was full of food. Not firewood or coal, but actual food. Sacks of grain, barrels of salted fish, bundles of dried peas and beans, even what looked like wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth. This was a merchant's cargo, Agnes realized, goods being transported upriver when the freeze came. Good that would be worth a fortune at current prices. "We can't take all this," Edmund said, his voice tight. "This isn't some wherryman's firewood. This belongs to someone, some merchant who will notice it's gone, who will have the means to." "To what?" Marsh interrupted. "To reach it through a foot of ice. To prove who took it. To do anything except sit in his warm house and curse the weather." He was already heaving a sack of grain toward the edge of the boat. "This is better than I hoped. We can sell this for—" "Agnes, are you listening?" Agnes wasn't listening. She was staring at something she had noticed in the stern of the boat, in the small covered area. A shape that was wrong somehow, that didn't belong. She moved closer, her heart beginning to pound. It was a person. A man huddled in the stern, wrapped in a cloak and blankets, frozen solid. His face was turned toward her, eyes closed, mouth slightly open as if he had died mid-breath. Ice crystals covered his beard and eyelashes, making him look like some grotesque sculpture. His hands were pulled close to his chest, as if trying to capture some last bit of warmth that had long since fled. "There's a body," Agnes said, her voice strange in her own ears. Edmund and Marsh turned, and she heard Marsh's sharp intake of breath. "The wherryman," Edmund said quietly. "He must have been sheltering in his boat when the freeze came, waiting it out, and the cold." He didn't finish the sentence. "He didn't need to." They stood in silence for a moment, the three of them looking at the dead man. Agnes felt something twist in her chest, pity, horror, and beneath it all a terrible understanding. This man had made a choice, to stay with his boat and his cargo rather than abandon it and try to reach shore. He had valued his goods over his safety. And that choice had killed him. How different was she really? She was here in the darkness, stealing from the dead, risking her own life for money. The same winter that had killed this man was the winter she was trying to survive. They were both victims of it, and both making desperate gambles against it. His gamble had failed. Hers might yet fail too. "We should go," Edmund said. This changes things. If there's a body, there will be questions. The wardmote may be the sheriff. An investigation. All the more reason to take what we can now, Marsh argued. Once they find the body, they'll secure the boat, maybe even put a guard on it. This is our only chance. It's wrong, Agnes heard herself say. Both men looked at her. It's wrong to steal from a dead man, she continued, still looking at the frozen corpse. To take from someone who died trying to protect what was his. He's dead, Marsh said, not unkindly. What we take or don't take won't change that. But what we take might keep us alive. Might keep dozens of people alive if we sell it fairly. Is that what we're telling ourselves? Agnes asked. That we're helping people. We are helping people, Marsh insisted. Food is scarce. People are starving. We're redistributing goods that would otherwise sit here, unused until the thaw. That's not theft. It's theft, Edmund interrupted quietly. Let's not pretend otherwise. But Marsh is right about one thing. The man is dead and we are alive, and staying alive matters. He looked at Agnes. You know that as well as anyone. You wouldn't be here if you didn't. Agnes did know that. She knew it in her bones, in her empty stomach, in the memory of her cold room and her dwindling coins and Robert Godwin's threats. She knew it in every practical, pragmatic part of her that had learned to survive in a city that cared nothing for women alone and poor. But knowing it didn't make it easier. Didn't make her feel less like a scavenger picking over carrion. Take what you need, she said finally. I'll help. But we're not lying about what this is. We're thieves. And she gestured at the frozen man. He deserves better than to be robbed as well as killed. Then what do you suggest? Marsh asked, his tone hovering between irritation and genuine curiosity. Agnes thought for a moment. We take what we need to survive. No more. 1 sack of grain, some of the dried peas, maybe some fish. Enough to keep us going, to sell for fair prices to people who need it. But we leave the rest. We leave most of it, so when they find him and find his cargo, they'll see he died protecting something, not that he died for nothing. It was a small thing, a meaningless gesture perhaps. The dead man would never know the difference, but somehow it mattered to Agnes, this line she was drawing. She would steal to survive, but she wouldn't strip a dead man's boat bare. She would cross some lines but not others. It was arbitrary, perhaps even foolish. But it was the only way she could live with what she was becoming. Edmund looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, he said. We take what we need. No more. Marsh grumbled, but didn't argue further. Together they selected their goods carefully. 1 sack of grain, half a sack of dried peas, a small barrel of salted fish that Agnes judged would weigh perhaps 30 pounds. They worked quietly, respectfully almost, trying not to disturb the rest of the cargo or the frozen figure in the stern. When they had finished, Agnes turned back to the dead man one last time. She didn't know any prayers, not really. Her mother had been pious, but her own faith had always been uncertain, a thing of obligation rather than conviction. But she knew enough to cross herself and murmur, "God rest your soul." It wasn't much, but it was something. They carried their takings back to the cart, making 2 trips across the ice. The grain was heavy, the barrel awkward, and by the time they had everything loaded, Agnes's shoulders were burning with effort. But they worked efficiently, and within 20 minutes they were ready to leave. That was when they heard the sound. A crack, sharp and clear, like a branch breaking. They froze, all 3 of them. For a moment there was only silence and the wind. Then another crack, and this time Agnes felt it as much as heard it. A vibration through the ice beneath her feet, a shifting that spoke of pressure and stress and weakness. "Move," Edmund hissed. Carefully but quickly. Back to the bank. They began moving, abandoning any pretense of stealth. The cart rumbled over the rough ice, louder than Agnes would have liked, but not as loud as her hammering heart. Behind them, she heard another crack, then a sound like tearing cloth, then a rushing splash that could only be water. "Don't look back," Marsh panted. "Just move." Agnes looked back anyway. She couldn't help it. And what she saw made her blood freeze more thoroughly than any winter cold. The ice where they had been standing, where the wherry was frozen, was breaking. Not just cracking, breaking, falling away in chunks, revealing dark water beneath. The boat was shifting, tilting, as the ice that had held it dissolved. The frozen man in the stern was visible for a moment, illuminated by some trick of moonlight through the clouds, and then the boat tipped further and he slid from sight into the black water. "Run," Edmund shouted. They ran. The cart bounced and slewed across the ice, threatening to tip, but they didn't slow down. Behind them, Agnes could hear more ice breaking and could hear water churning. The frozen river, which had seemed so solid and permanent, was revealing its true nature, temporary, treacherous, liable to open up and swallow anything on its surface. They made it to the bank and scrambled up, dragging the cart behind them. Only when they were safely on solid ground did they stop, gasping for breath, and look back. The wherry was gone. Where it had been there was now a dark patch of open water, perhaps 20 feet across, with chunks of ice floating on its surface. Even as they watched, the edges were already beginning to freeze again, the cold working to seal over the wound in the river's skin. By morning, it would be solid again, and no one would know that beneath it lay a boat and a frozen man, and all his cargo settling into the mud at the bottom of the Thames. Jesus Christ and all the saints, Marsh breathed. We were standing on that 5 minutes ago. The current, Edmund said, his voice shaking slightly. It must run faster there, keeps the ice thinner. We should have tested it more carefully, should have. Should have nothing, Marsh interrupted. We didn't know. We couldn't have known. And we got off in time. That's what matters. Agnes said nothing. She was looking at the cart, at the sack of grain and the barrel of fish they had taken from the boat that was now at the bottom of the river. The dead man who was now truly gone, not frozen in death but swallowed by the dark water. They had stolen from him, and within minutes the river had erased all evidence that he or his cargo had ever existed. It felt like judgment, like the universe itself had witnessed their crime and moved to conceal it, or perhaps to punish it, only missing them by minutes. "We need to go," Edmund said. If the watch heard that ice breaking, they might come to investigate. They went, moving quickly through the silent streets, their cart full of stolen goods, their consciences burdened with something heavier than grain or fish. They didn't speak during the journey to Marsh's warehouse. There seemed to be nothing to say. At the warehouse, they unloaded in silence. Marsh covered the goods with canvas and promised to sell them the next day. Edmund took his share of what they had brought back, a portion of the dried peas, enough for his own household, and disappeared into the night. Agnes took a smaller share, just a few pounds of the fish and some of the peas, enough to supplement her diet for a week or two, but not so much as to attract attention if anyone saw her with it. She walked home through streets that seemed even colder than before, if that was possible. The stars were visible now, the clouds having cleared, and they looked distant and pitiless in the black sky. The city around her was mostly silent, just the occasional sound of someone coughing or a baby crying, the small sounds of survival in the depths of winter. Back in her room, Agnes sat on her pallet and stared at the small bundle of food she had brought back. She had been hungry an hour ago. Now the thought of eating made her stomach turn. She kept seeing the dead man's face, peaceful in its frozen sleep. She kept hearing the sound of ice breaking, of water rushing to reclaim what should never have been solid. She kept thinking about how close they had come to joining that man at the bottom of the river, how thin the line was between survival and death, between getting away with theft and paying for it with your life. Was this who she was now, a woman who stole from the dead? A woman who risked her life for dried peas and salted fish? A woman who made bargains with merchants and clerks, who learned the roots of the watch and the weak points in the ice, who compromised every principle her mother had taught her? Yes, a voice in her head answered, "This is who you are now. This is who you have to be." And another voice, smaller and sadder, "This is who the winter has made you." Agnes lay down on her pallet, still fully clothed, and pulled her blanket over her. Outside, the wind howled and the temperature continued to drop. Tomorrow the city would wake to another day of frozen misery, another day of inflated prices and dwindling supplies, another day of survival at any cost. Tomorrow she would eat the food she had stolen from a dead man. Tomorrow she would plan her next move, consider her next theft, decide how far she was willing to go. Tomorrow she will continue the work of staying alive. But tonight, in the darkness and cold of her room, Agnes allowed herself to feel the weight of what she had become, to acknowledge the theft and the fear and the strange, terrible freedom that came from discovering she was capable of things she had never imagined, to mourn, perhaps, for the person she had been before this winter, before the ice, before hunger and desperation had stripped away all her comfortable illusions about herself. She had thought she knew who she was, a laundress, poor but honest, hardworking, respectable. Now she knew better. She was a thief and a survivor, a woman who would steal from the dead if she had to, who would risk drowning in the dark waters beneath the ice, who would do whatever was necessary to see another dawn. It wasn't the person her mother had raised her to be. But her mother was dead, and Agnes was alive, and in the mathematics of survival, that was the only equation that mattered. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no rest. She dreamed of ice breaking beneath her feet, of dark water closing over her head, of sinking down and down past frozen boats and frozen men to settle in the cold mud at the river's bottom. She dreamed of her mother's voice calling to her from somewhere far away, asking what she had become, asking if survival was worth the price she was paying for it. And in her dreams, Agnes had no answer, only the certain knowledge that she would wake in the morning and do it all again if she had to. That she would steal and risk and compromise and survive, because survival was all she had left, the only thing she could still control in a world that had frozen solid around her. The bell of St. Paul's rang in the darkness, marking another hour, another increment in the slow passage of this endless winter. And Agnes slept on, dreaming her dark dreams, while outside the ice grew thicker and the cold pressed down, and the city endured, as cities do, as people do, through all the hardships that winter and the world could bring. When Agnes woke the next morning, the quality of light filtering through her shutters seemed different somehow. Not brighter exactly, but less oppressive, as though the iron-gray sky had softened fractionally. She lay still for a moment, listening to the city waking around her, the distant calls of vendors, the creak of carts on frozen streets, the bells of churches marking the hour. Her body ached from the previous night's exertions, and her conscience ached from something deeper. But she was alive, and she had food, and the rent was paid. These were victories, however small, however compromised. She rose and prepared a simple meal from the food she had brought back. Some of the salted fish boiled with dried peas to make a thin but nourishing soup. As she ate, sitting on her pallet with the bowl warming her hands, Agnes found herself thinking not about what she had done, but about what came next. The winter would not last forever. Springs always came eventually. The ice would melt, the boats would sail again, the normal rhythms of commerce and life would resume. And when that happened, what would she be? Could she return to being simply a laundress, taking and washing and scrubbing clothes in the river? Or had she changed too fundamentally to go back to that quiet, anonymous existence? She didn't know. But she thought perhaps the question itself was a kind of progress, not the return to innocence, which was impossible, but the beginning of understanding who she might become now that innocence was gone. Over the following weeks, Agnes, Edmund, and Marsh made 3 more trips onto the ice. Each time they were more cautious, more careful, more aware of the dangers. They varied their routes and their timing. They took only what they needed and could safely carry. And they sold their goods not for the highest prices they could get, but for fair ones, enough to profit, but not so much as to exploit the desperation of others. It was a strange kind of honor among thieves, perhaps, but it was an honor nonetheless. The money Agnes earned allowed her not just to survive, but to begin to plan beyond mere survival. She paid her rent each month without fail, building a reputation with Robert Godwin as a reliable tenant. She bought warmer clothes from the used clothing vendors. She even managed to set aside a small store of coins against future emergencies, hidden carefully in a crack in the wall of her room where no one would think to look. And something else happened, something Agnes hadn't expected. She discovered that she had a talent for this new life she had fallen into. She could read the ice, judge which areas were safe and which weren't. She could move quietly and think quickly. She could negotiate with Marsh's contacts, selling their goods with a combination of honesty about their quality and discretion about their origins that made her valuable to their small enterprise. Edmund noticed it too. "You're good at this," he told her one evening as they divided their profits in Marsh's warehouse. "Better than I expected. Better than I am, if I'm honest." "I don't know if that's something to be proud of," Agnes said, but she felt a small glow of satisfaction nonetheless. "Survival is always something to be proud of," Edmund replied. "Especially in times like these." The winter did not end quickly. January gave way to February, and February wore on with the same relentless cold, the same frozen river, the same desperate struggle for food and fuel. But gradually, imperceptibly at first, things began to change. The ice market near London Bridge grew larger and more organized. What had begun as a few desperate vendors selling scraps became a proper fair, with tents and stalls, entertainers and food sellers, even a printer who set up his press on the ice and sold commemorative broadsheets describing the Great Frost of 1434. People came from all over the city to walk on the frozen Thames, to marvel at what would surely be talked about for generations to come. Agnes set up her own small stall there, selling firewood and coal legitimately acquired, or at least acquired with enough discretion that no one asked difficult questions. She became a familiar face on the ice, a young woman who worked hard and asked fair prices, who helped customers carry their purchases to shore and sometimes gave a bit extra to those who looked most desperate. It was a kind of penance, perhaps, a way of balancing the scales for what she had taken in darkness. In late February, nearly 3 months after the freeze began, the weather finally began to shift. The temperatures, while still cold, rose above freezing during the brightest part of the day. The ice started to thin at the edges. Cracks appeared on the surface of the river, and people began to speak nervously about when the thaw would come in earnest. The ice market was hastily dismantled. No one wanted to be on the river when it finally broke. Agnes and her companions made one final trip before it became too dangerous, and then they stopped, agreeing without needing to say that they had pushed their luck far enough. When the thaw came, it came suddenly. Agnes woke one morning in early March to the sound of cracking and groaning from the direction of the river, not the sharp, localized sounds of ice breaking under strain, but a deep, sustained roar as the entire frozen surface began to give way. She joined the crowds who rushed to the banks to watch as the ice broke into great chunks that turned and tumbled in the rushing water, grinding against each other with a sound like thunder. The Thames was alive again, dark and powerful and free. Boats that had been frozen in place for months were either swept away or left damaged on the banks. The wherries and barges that had survived began moving again, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as the last of the ice disappeared. London began to breathe again. Supplies that had been trapped downriver finally reached the city. Food prices began to drop. Coal and firewood became available at something approaching normal costs. The desperate edge that had characterized life during the freeze slowly eased. Agnes returned to her work as a laundress, though she found it strange after months of different labor. Her hands, which had grown somewhat softer during the freeze, quickly became raw and chapped again from the constant immersion in cold water. But it was honest work, and there was a comfort in that, a return to something simple and straightforward. She saw Edmund occasionally, passing on the streets or at the market. They would nod to each other but rarely spoke. There was an understanding between them that what had happened during the winter was separate from ordinary life, a thing that belonged to that frozen time and need not be discussed in the warmth of spring. Marsh she saw more often, as she sometimes bought fish from his stall at Billingsgate. He always gave her fair prices and sometimes a bit extra, winking as he wrapped her purchases. Neither of them spoke about what they had done together, but the knowledge was there between them, a bond forged in desperation and danger. The dead man from the boat sometimes appeared in Agnes's dreams. Not as a nightmare exactly, but as a presence, a reminder of how close she had come to sharing his fate. In her dreams, he would look at her with his ice crystal eyes and say nothing, but his silence felt like understanding rather than judgment. They were both victims of the same winter, she came to think. He had lost his gamble with it, and she had won hers, but the difference between them was luck and timing more than virtue. As the months passed and spring gave way to summer, Agnes found that she had changed in ways both obvious and subtle. She was more confident, more assured in her movements through the city. She spoke up when she might previously have remained silent. She negotiated better prices for her work. She saved more carefully, always mindful that another winter would come, that the world could turn hard and cold again without warning. But she was also gentler in some ways, more aware of suffering around her. When she saw women who looked as desperate as she had been during the freeze, she would sometimes give them work or recommend them to her clients. She bought bread for beggars when she could afford it. She helped a young girl who reminded her of herself, teaching her the laundress's trade and making sure she ate enough. It was as though, having crossed certain lines and survived, she felt both more capable of hard choices and more obligated to make kind ones when she could. The winter had not made her either purely good or purely bad. It had simply made her more herself, more aware of what she was capable of for both ill and good. By the time the first anniversary of the Great Freeze approached, Agnes had saved enough money to move to a better room, 2 rooms actually, in a building near St. Mary-le-Bow that had a proper hearth and shutters that closed tightly. She could afford to keep a small fire going even in the coldest weather. She had enough put aside that she would never again face starvation if work grew scarce. She had survived. More than survived, she had emerged from the winter stronger, more capable, more resilient. The cost had been high, and she would carry the weight of what she had done for the rest of her life. But she was alive, and she had learned what many people never learned, that she had depths of strength and courage she had never suspected, that she could do what needed to be done, that survival itself was a kind of victory. On a cold December evening, almost exactly a year after the Great Freeze began, Agnes stood on the bank of the Thames and looked out at the flowing water. The river was high and dark, swollen with winter rain but not frozen. It would freeze again someday, perhaps not as completely as it had the year before, but enough to remind people of nature's power, of winter's indifference to human suffering. But Agnes was ready now. She had warm rooms and stored food and money put aside. She had learned the lessons the ice had taught her about preparation and resilience and the importance of doing what was necessary. She had learned that she was capable of more than she had imagined, for both good and ill. She had learned that survival sometimes required compromises, but that those compromises need not define her entirely. A light snow began to fall as she stood there, soft flakes that melted as soon as they touched the dark water. Agnes watched them fall for a moment, then pulled her cloak, a new one, warm and well-made, tighter around her shoulders, and turned toward home. Behind her, the Thames flowed on, powerful and eternal, caring nothing for the small human dramas played out on its banks. It had been there long before Agnes was born and would be there long after she was gone. It would freeze and thaw, flood and recede, carry boats and drown sailors, provide for the city and threaten it, just as it always had. But Agnes Carpenter, 19-year-old laundress and survivor of the Great Freeze of 1434, had learned to respect it without fearing it, to understand its dangers without being paralyzed by them. She had walked on its frozen surface when it seemed impossible. She had stolen from its trapped boats when desperation demanded it. She had seen it swallow a man and nearly swallow her. And she had survived, not unchanged, not innocent, not without scars, but alive and stronger for it, and ready for whatever winters might come. As she walked through the lamplit streets toward her warm rooms and her secure future, Agnes allowed herself a small smile. The winter had tried to kill her, had tested her in every way she could be tested, and she had endured. She had become someone she had never expected to be, neither the person her mother had hoped she would be, nor the person she had feared becoming, but someone new, someone forged in ice and darkness and desperate choice. Someone who had learned that survival was not just about enduring, but about becoming strong enough to help others endure. Someone who understood that the lines between right and wrong were sometimes blurred by necessity, but who still tried to do right when she could. Someone who had looked into the darkness and found not just fear but courage, not just desperation but determination. The city around her was settling in for another winter night, fires being banked, shutters being closed, families gathering in what warmth they could find. And Agnes, walking through it all toward home, felt a deep and quiet gratitude for this ordinary evening, this simple return to rooms where she would be safe and warm. The Great Freeze had passed into history, would be talked about for years to come, would be recorded in chronicles and remembered in stories. But for Agnes, it was more than history. It was the crucible that had shaped her, the winter that had shown her who she truly was beneath all her assumptions about herself. She was a survivor. She was stronger than she looked. She was capable of hard choices and kind ones, of stealing to live and giving to help others live. She was complicated and compromised and courageous, flawed and fierce and fundamentally human. She was Agnes Carpenter, and she had endured.